Parry had been worrying about the continuity of land to the north for some time. There was a chance that it might turn south and join the coast of America. But then he saw a broad passage leading to the north that he named Wellington Channel. They sailed along, passing and naming Cornwallis, Griffith, and Bathurst Islands. However, towards the end of August, the sea began to fill with ice, and Parry knew it was time to look for winter quarters. He found them in Hecla and Griper Bay on the coast of Melville Island. The ships were made snug for the winter after the expedition had crossed the meridian, 110 degrees west, earning the reward of £5,000 for being the first British subject to penetrate so far within the Arctic Circle. They were just in time, as the bay was already covered with ice when they arrived. Parry immediately began the work of putting the ships in order for the winter. The upper masts were dismantled, the lower yards were lashed fore and aft amidships, and a roofing was erected over the deck so that the men could exercise indoors when the winter made it impossible to go outside. He then turned his attention to providing his crew with rational amusement, which was necessary for their good health. He was an excellent amateur actor, and founded the Royal Arctic Theatre with a couple of books of plays on board. Officers and men were occupied with scene painting and rehearsals for weeks. Finally, on November 5th, the theatrical season opened with a brilliant performance of Miss in Her Teens, with Parry as Fribble and Beachy as Miss Biddy. Sabine founded the North Georgia Gazette and Winter Chronicle, a weekly paper that most officers wrote for. Parry's poetic talents were revealed. Sabine was an exceptional dramatic critic, and numerous humorists emerged. An excerpt from the Gazette advertised for a middle-aged woman to dress ladies at the theater. Mrs. Abigail Handicraft replied, inquiring if women wore breeches, and if she could have able-bodied assistants to lace stays. Mrs. Handicraft was hired and received 2 assistants with marline spikes, levers, and white line for Beachy's waist. The theatricals provided amusement but were challenging due to the freezing stage. Captain Lyon injured 2 fingers while performing The Heir at Law. In early February the sun returned but offered little respite from the frigid temperatures. At times the thermometer plummeted to 55 degrees below zero, resulting in severe frostbite for some, including Sabine's servant, Smith. He rushed out without gloves in his haste to save some equipment from a fire at the observatory. Upon his return to the ship, the surgeon submerged his hands in water, causing them to freeze immediately. Despite the harsh conditions, the latter part of the winter brought about some stunning atmospheric sights. On March 4th, a halo appeared around the sun, emitting prismatic colors. 3 parhelia, or mock suns, were visible on the circle, with one directly above the sun and one on each side at its altitude. The prismatic tints were most vivid in the parhelia, with red, yellow, and blue being the only discernible colors. White rays of light extended in various directions beyond the halo, appearing brighter after passing through the circle. This remarkable phenomenon lasted for nearly 2 hours. On March 19th, the theater season concluded with performances of The Citizen and The Mayor of Garrett, in which Parry played Old Philpot and Matthew Mugg. The harshest part of winter was ending, but the ice remained unyielding. Despite snow melting in April and May, returning to England or continuing the voyage seemed impossible. June passed with no hope of release, and Parry feared being trapped in the ice for another winter, for which he was ill-prepared. At the end of July, the thaw began to affect the ice in the harbor, and on August 1st the 2 ships weighed anchor and sailed out of the bay. However, they were unable to achieve much more. They were held back by contrary winds and battered by ice for several weeks. Eventually, on August 23rd, Parry decided to return to England as the navigation season would be ending in 2 weeks. The 2 ships reached Peterhead safely on October 29th. Chapter 5. The First Overland Journey of Franklin. Let us now turn our attention to John Franklin, companion of Parry and fellow explorer, whom we last encountered during his audience with Lord Melville on November 18, 1818. As we recall, Parry was granted the command of the Hecla and Griper. At the same time, Franklin was tasked with leading an equally significant overland expedition to explore the shores of North America from the Coppermine River's mouth to the east. Franklin's expedition consisted of 5 members: Dr. John Richardson, a Navy surgeon; George Back, a mate on the Trent during Franklin's 1818 voyage, Robert Hood, a midshipman, and John Hepburn, a sailor serving as a servant. The objective was to meticulously survey the coast, place visible markers at ship entry points, and gather information on the coast's geography to benefit Parry's search for a northwest passage. Franklin was also to conduct scientific observations, taking note of temperature fluctuations, weather conditions, magnetic needle dip and variation, and magnetic force intensity. To improve his chances of success, Franklin carried letters of recommendation from the governors of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, two major fur trading outfits in British North America. These letters instructed their agents to do everything possible to advance the expedition's interests. Upon arriving at Hudson's Bay, Franklin went to the York factory to consult with officials, including Mr. Williams, the governor of the factory, on the best route to the copper mine's mouth, where the expedition's significant work would begin. They advised him to travel north along the company's posts chain to the Great Slave Lake, starting from Cumberland House. This route is practically all water, but many portages exist between the various streams and lakes. Mr. Williams offered the expedition one of the company's best boats, along with provisions and other necessary items for the journey. Unfortunately, the provisions were too bulky to fit in the boat, so they had to leave behind a large portion, including bacon, rice, flour, ammunition, and tobacco. The governor promised to send them on during the next season. Despite the beautiful scenery, they set out on September 9th and found the journey very difficult. The rivers were narrow, winding, and full of rapids. The current was often too swift for sails or oars, so they had to tow the boat. The shores were rocky, lofty, and intersected by ravines and tributary streams. In addition, countless portages slowed their progress to a crawl. Finally, they reached Rock House, a Hudson's Bay Company post, where they were told that even worse rapids lay ahead. The boat had to be lightened to reach Cumberland House before winter set in. Franklin had to leave even more cargo behind, with orders to be forwarded by the Athabasca canoes as early as possible in the following season. As they continued their journey, they arrived at Cumberland House on October 23rd, only to find the lake already freezing over, making it impossible for them to proceed. Governor Williams suggested they winter at Cumberland House, and they agreed. After discussing with the two company's officers, Franklin realized his best plan was to venture overland during the winter into the Athabasca Department to obtain the necessary resources. He requested dogs, sleds, and drivers from Mr. Williams, and began their journey on January 18th, 1820. After traveling 857 miles in freezing temperatures, they arrived at Fort Chipewyan on March 26th. Franklin spent several months gathering information from the Indians and the two companies' interpreters about the Coppermine River and its coast. He decided to send messages to the company's representatives on the Great Slave Lake for additional knowledge and to engage Copper Indians as guides and hunters. By May 10th, Franklin realized it was time to move on, but faced difficulty obtaining the necessary supplies and men. The provisions at the fort were limited, and the company's employees were hesitant to join the expedition without high payment. On July 13th, Richardson and Hood came onto the scene with provisions collected from Cumberland House and Isle à la Crosse. Unfortunately, the Canadian voyagers from Hudson's Bay Post had eaten all the pemmican meant for the explorers. 10 bags of provisions from the last post were moldy and had to be discarded. As a result, the travelers had to start ill-equipped. However, they could not delay their departure as Fort Chipewyan could not sustain such a large party. The supplies were divided among the 3 canoes provided by Franklin. On July 18th, he set out with 4 officers, 16 Canadian voyagers, 2 interpreters, and the formidable Hepburn. At the end of the month, they reached Fort Providence, where they met Mr. Wenzel, an agent of the Northwest Company. He proposed to recruit hunters for them and would accompany them to the Coppermine River. They negotiated with a group of hunters under a Kaicho, or Bigfoot, and were successful. Although the Indians were disappointed that the English medicine men couldn't bring their dead members back to life as rumored, they were won over by small gifts and promised to support the expedition. On August 2nd, the party set forth, slightly augmented by an extra interpreter, Michel, an Iroquois, Mr. Wenzel, and the wives of 3 voyagers who would make clothes and shoes for the men during winter quarters. On August 19th they arrived, where the Indians had settled as the most suitable location for winter quarters. Winter loomed before them, so Franklin directed his men to erect a storehouse and sent out Indian hunters to gather fresh meat. However, the hunters proved unreliable. Akaicho, upon hearing of his brother-in-law's death, and his party mourned for days. They only managed to kill 15 deer, and their mourning resulted in the relocation of Akaicho's tribe from the proposed storage site. To make matters worse, Akaicho refused to accompany Franklin on a preliminary copper mine excursion due to the extreme hazards of such a journey at that time of year. Despite Akaicho's discouragement, the expedition returned unscathed. By October 20th, the log house was complete, providing a luxurious haven from the bitter weather. The walls, daubed with clay, were not impervious to the cold winds, but it was a significant improvement over the tents. Hunting was no longer an option, and the storehouse was well stocked. 80 deer carcasses were stowed away in a cache, covered with heavy wood and stones to prevent wolves and wolverines from accessing them. Franklin, though, was growing uneasy at the lack of ammunition and tobacco. The former was essential for the party's survival, and the Canadians, who were avid smokers, had requested a generous supply of the latter. However, the officials of the 2 companies who had pledged to provide these stores had failed to deliver. The only solution was to send members of the party back for supplies. On October 18th, Back and Wenzel, along with 2 Indians and 2 Canadians, embarked on the long journey to Fort Providence. The first group returned on December 23rd, but the last did not arrive until mid-March, after walking more than 1,000 miles. Back faced difficult challenges, often going days without food and sleeping in the woods with only a blanket and deerskin, despite temperatures dropping to 40 and even 57 degrees below zero. He discovered that the supplies had not been delivered due to the negligence of some company officials. For instance, a Hudson's Bay officer refused to burden his canoe with the supplies, leaving them on the shore to the detriment of the expedition. Eventually, enough supplies arrived to alleviate the immediate danger of starvation. In June, the main work of the expedition began. On the 4th, the first party, led by Dr. Richardson, departed from Fort Enterprise and headed north by land. 10 days later, a second party with 2 canoes on trains embarked to reach Winter Lake, which was nearby. They were followed almost immediately by the third party, under Franklin, who brought the instruments, the remainder of the stores, and a small stock of dried meat. The fates seemed to be against the expedition from the very start, for when Franklin came up with the canoe party at Martin Lake, he found that the hunters had only killed 2 deer, and that though these had been placed in cache, they had both been consumed by wolves. Worse still, when he joined Richardson on the 21st, he learned that Akaicho and his son had expended all their ammunition and had nothing to show for it. Fortunately, the doctor, assisted by his 2 hunters, had been able to secure and prepare 200 pounds of dried meat, but this constituted practically all the stores they had for their long journey. By July 12th they had reached the boundaries of the Eskimo territory, and the Indians, who were at constant war with these natives, refused point-blank to go any further, so all that Franklin could do was to dismiss them after extracting from them a solemn promise to prepare provisions at Fort Enterprise for their return. A few hours later the sea was reached, and here Franklin parted with Wenzel and 2 of the Canadians, thus reducing his party to 20 men. He planned to explore the coast as far east of the copper mine as possible. If the conditions allowed, he would return to the river. If not, he intended to strike north across a rocky desert known as the Barren Grounds and make for Fort Enterprise. Wenzel was requested to see that an ample supply of meat was provided at the fort for the party on its return. The band of 20 now found themselves at the mouth of the copper mine, 334 miles from their headquarters, with provisions sufficient for only 15 days. On July 21st, they launched their 2 frail canoes and embarked on the eastward voyage. That it was dangerous goes without saying, for the thin sides of their vessels afforded inadequate protection against the masses of ice they were constantly encountering. For 5 weeks they kept moving northward, naming landmarks and documenting their observations. They covered 650 miles of the coast, marking capes, islands, and bays. On August 16th, they arrived at Point Turnagain, located at latitude 68 degrees 18 minutes north and longitude 109 degrees 25 minutes west. Franklin decided that it was time to turn back. The open season was ending, and their canoes were in poor condition. The shortage of provisions had become a serious concern. The two interpreters, Saint Germain and Adam, had been successful in hunting game earlier in the expedition. However, their supplies had dwindled as they had opposed the trip and wanted to force a return. They turned their canoes and headed back. The journey was difficult, but they reached Hood's River on August 25th. Unfortunately, the river was too shallow and fast-moving, so they had to dismantle their canoes and construct two smaller ones that were easily portable. By the end of the month, they had finished preparations. The group divided their supplies, including ammunition, nets, hatchets, ice chisels, astronomical instruments, 3 kettles, 2 canoes, and a tent. Each member carried a pack of about 90 pounds. They followed the Hood River for a few days, but it curved westward, and they had to move inland across the desolate barren grounds. The land was unattractive, with no vegetation or living creatures in sight. The terrain was a vast stony waste, and they rarely found wood for fires. The only benefit was that it was relatively flat, and they did not have to climb hills or valleys. In the unforgiving wilderness, the grim reality set in after a mere day of travel. Winter had arrived ahead of schedule. Their plight was worsened 100-fold by this turn of events. The news came with a fierce gale that raged through the night, too powerful to fight against. They were left with no choice but to remain in their tents. For 2 days, they huddled in their blankets, shivering in the cold, and plagued by hunger. Their provisions were depleted, save for a scant amount of portable soup and arrowroot, which they guarded jealously. By the morning of the 7th day, the gale had weakened, but the cold still held them in its icy grip. They faced 2 options: brave the storm's onslaught or succumb to the freezing temperatures. They chose the former, their heavy load slowing them to 1-mile-per-hour crawl under the best conditions. Now the snow-covered ground and icy marshes impeded their progress further. The storm's fury was unrelenting, and the Canadians carrying the boats were frequently blown off their feet. The larger of the 2 boats was soon destroyed, and Franklin suspected foul play, a deliberate act of sabotage. In the face of such adversity, he chose to make the best of their situation. He built a fire with the wreckage and used it to cook their last scraps of arrowroot and soup. They trudged on wearily for many dull days, surviving on the occasional partridge or tripe de roche, an edible lichen found on boulders. This meager fare was hardly enough for the starving company of 20 men. The tripe de roche, while staving off hunger temporarily, was exceedingly bitter and even noxious to some of the party. Their physical suffering grew increasingly unbearable. Hunger was not their only trial. They also had to wade through swamps, and with the thermometer perpetually below freezing, their wet clothes froze solid, making walking even more painful. Though they occasionally stumbled upon musk oxen or deer, their supply was never enough. Most of the time they had to subsist on tripe de roche, which now made every member of the party sick. On September 10th they discovered a large lake, and Franklin's flagging spirits rose at the possibility of catching fish. To his dismay, he learned that the Canadians had thrown away their nets and burnt their floats to lighten their loads. This was especially odd given that they were experienced voyagers for trading companies who often relied on fishing for sustenance. These Canadians, except a man named Perrault, proved to be an insufferable nuisance throughout the journey. Their worst blunder was destroying the second canoe, the only means of crossing rivers and lakes. The loss was most acutely felt when the party arrived at the Coppermine's bank and found themselves unable to cross. They wasted precious days building a raft or searching for a ford while subsisting on a putrid deer carcass. Richardson attempted to swim across with a line around his waist when these efforts failed. Despite the numbing cold, he almost reached the other side before exhaustion overtook him. He survived, but felt the effects for months. Eventually, the party crossed in a frail canoe made of canvas, but only one person could travel at a time. 3 Canadians scouted ahead while the rest of the party struggled on, surviving on lichen and old shoes. Hood and 2 others grew too weak to continue, so the party split up again. Franklin led a few companions to the fort, while Richardson and Hepburn stayed with the weaker members. They camped in a willow thicket, but the Canadians couldn't make it that far and were left in the snow. As Franklin and his crew limped towards their destination, 3 of their party, Bélanger, Perrault, Fontano, and Michel the Iroquois, were forced to turn back due to exhaustion. Undeterred, Franklin continued with his remaining men until they finally caught sight of their objective. But their hopes were quickly crushed as they entered the fort to find it empty, devoid of provisions, and with no sign of the Indians they sought. The men were bitterly disappointed, facing a bleak and uncertain future. The only food available was a few discarded deerskins, and the harsh winter weather had wreaked havoc on the building, exposing them to sub-zero temperatures. They had no choice but to wait for Akaicho and his hunters to arrive with supplies. But relief did not come. 2 days later, a note arrived from Back, reporting that he too had been unable to locate the Indians. Franklin, weakened but determined, decided to take matters into his own hands and set out for Fort Confidence with 2 companions. However, he was forced to turn back after just 2 days when he broke a shoe, leaving his men to continue alone. The 2 Canadians he had left behind had grown so weak that they had given up and were prepared to die. Franklin's inspiring example infused them with fresh courage, and with great effort they managed to stay alive, although they were now so feeble that they couldn't shoot a herd of deer that had appeared half a mile away. On the 29th, as they sat around a pitiful fire, they were surprised to hear voices in the next room. They thought that the Indians had finally come to their rescue, but it was Richardson and Hepburn who entered a moment later. The arrival of these friends brought some hope to the starving men at Fort Enterprise. Hepburn was stronger than the others, and there was a chance that he could find them some food. But seeing those 2 men standing there alone sent a shiver down Franklin's spine. What had become of Hood, Credit, Michel, and Vaillant? The answer he received the following day was worse than his worst fears. Richardson's story went like this. On the morning of October 9th, 2 days after Franklin had left for Fort Enterprise, Michel, the Iroquois, returned to camp alone, claiming that Bélanger, who had left with him, had abandoned him. However, there were many reasons to suspect that Michel had murdered Bélanger and made up the story to cover it up. From then on, Michel's behavior became more and more suspicious. He grew sullen and refused to hunt, or only when alone, taking his hatchet with him. Finally, on Sunday, October 20th, when left alone with Hood, he deliberately shot his companion in the head. In their weakened state, the doctor or the sailor couldn't serve justice on the murderer, even though it was necessary for their survival. They buried Michel's victim, and on the 23rd, the 3 of them decided to head towards the fort, since the others hadn't made it to the camp. It was painfully clear that the Iroquois intended to kill his 2 companions, just like his previous victims, leaving only one option for them. Richardson took the opportunity to shoot Michel through the head with a pistol when he wasn't expecting it. After 6 days of excruciating suffering, they finally reached the fort, discovering that Franklin and the Canadians were in no better condition. The Canadians, Pelletier and Samandre, succumbed in the following days, and their friends would have followed if help had not arrived on November 7th. 3 Indians, found by Back, appeared on that day, and although it took a while for the sufferers to regain their health and strength, their troubles were practically over. They left Fort Enterprise on November 16th and arrived at Moose Deer Island on December 18th, where Back joined them after going through his own period of hardship and deprivation during his search for help. In the summer of the next year, Franklin returned to England after completing a terrible journey of about 5,500 miles. Chapter 6. Parry's Final Northwest Voyages. We must now revisit Parry, who arrived in England in October 1820 after making valuable discoveries in Lancaster Sound. His voyage was so successful that the government prepared another expedition for the following year. It was expected that efforts to find a northwest passage through Lancaster Sound would be futile due to the impenetrable ice barrier. Therefore, they decided to take a more southerly route, hoping for a more temperate climate and less ice obstruction. On the first expedition, the Hecla was an excellent ship, but the Griper was less successful due to poor sailing qualities. For the second expedition, the Fury replaced the Griper, and Parry himself was commissioned to lead it. Captain George Francis Lyon, known for his excellent drawings, was placed in command of the Hecla. Parry was so popular that many previous expedition members volunteered to join him. This included Lieutenant Hopner, Myas, and Reed, Midshipman James Clark Ross, who had experience in Arctic travel and later discovered the magnetic pole, and Mr. Edwards, Parry's former surgeon. The expedition consisted of 118 officers and men. Parry set sail at the end of April with instructions to head for Hudson Strait, sail westward until reaching some part of North America's mainland, then turn northward and examine every bay and inlet that might provide a passage to the west. This continued the exploration work of Captain Middleton, who discovered Wager Inlet in 1742 and reached as far north as Cape Hope near the entrance to Repulse Bay. He arrived at Southampton Island on April 27th after facing delays caused by the ice. Eventually, he managed to navigate through Frozen Strait and reach Repulse Bay. Until then, the true nature of the bay remained unknown to many, who believed it to be a straits entrance. However, Parry discovered it was indeed a bay, and turned northward in his search for a western passage. The coast was so rugged that his progress was slow, and by early October he had only reached the entrance to Lyon Inlet. Nonetheless, his work during those 6 weeks was immensely valuable, as he mapped out every mile of a previously unexplored coast. As the season was too far advanced, he decided to sail southeast to find comfortable winter quarters on the south side of Winter Island. On October 8th, he found a well-suited bay for this purpose, after a perilous voyage through the ice. Accordingly, he stopped there and made preparations for the winter months. There is no need to discuss how the crew passed their time. They repeated the successful theatrical performances from the previous voyage, held concerts, and did everything possible to avoid scurvy, the Arctic explorer's archenemy. Meanwhile, scientific observations continued without interruption. In early February, a group of Eskimos arrived. The explorers were surprised that a complete village had sprung up in their vicinity with speed usually reserved for fairy tale castles. The explanation was simple. The huts were constructed entirely from snow and ice. The locals were amicable and less greedy than their peers. Typically, the first word the Eskimos taught to the uninitiated traveler is pilate, which means give me, and is uttered by these natives when encountering an unknown object. Beads and nails were presented as customary gifts. The beneficiaries of these offerings would express their gratitude rather awkwardly. When given something, they would erupt into hysterical screams or laughter, accompanied by women's periodic weeping. Besides gaining some insight into Eskimo customs, the explorers acquired scant information of value and learned nothing about the western passage they were seeking. One of the women fashioned a rough map of the coast north of Repulse Bay, which Captain Lyon nearly perished attempting to verify in a snowstorm. Otherwise, the winter was uneventful. On July 2, 1822, the two ships departed from their winter dwellings and continued northward. The primary task of charting the coast, which occupied most of their attention, was occasionally replaced by hunting walruses, an excellent form of recreation. These creatures were incredibly powerful. During a hunt on July 15th, a walrus's tusks severely damaged one of the boats. Another time one of the creatures, accidentally touched by an oar, snatched it out of the rower's hand with its flippers and snapped it in two. The largest animal taken that day weighed 1,500 pounds. This was how the entire summer passed, and when winter arrived, they were as far from discovering the Northwest Passage as ever. Parry spent the dark season near the island of Igloolik, intending to continue his work the following summer. But an outbreak of scurvy forced him to alter his plans and cut short his voyage, returning to England in early October. Parry embarked on his third and final search for the Northwest Passage the next year. The expedition aimed to explore Prince Regent's Inlet, but bad ice and unfavorable weather impeded their progress. Winter arrived just as they reached their destination. The following year proved even more unfortunate, as a gale drove the Fury ashore, and Parry had to abandon her, taking her crew and as many supplies as he could fit on board the Hecla. With so many mouths to feed and so little food, Parry dared not risk another winter in the ice, and thus had no choice but to return home. However, the stores left behind on the ship and shore proved invaluable to later expeditions. One of the most valuable pieces of information Parry brought back was that the eastern coast of Arctic lands is usually burdened with heavy ice. In contrast, the western coast is comparatively free in ordinary years. Navigators have taken full advantage of this discovery ever since. Chapter 7. The Second Land Journey of Franklin. Undeterred by the hazards of his initial journey, Franklin wasted no time proposing a second expedition to the government. He planned to travel overland to the mouth of the Mackenzie River and thence by sea to the northwestern extremity of North America, with the combined object of surveying the coast between the Mackenzie and Coppermine rivers. The hope was that if Parry's expedition reached the Polar Sea, the two groups could assist each other. The government approved Franklin's plan and appointed him to lead the expedition. Having learned from his previous experiences, Franklin took precautions and ensured the team had enough supplies to avoid starvation. He oversaw the construction of 4 boats better suited for navigating the harsh Arctic waters. The boats varied in size, with the smallest being the walnut shell, which could be broken down into parcels for transportation. The team consisted of Franklin, Lieutenant Back, Dr. Richardson, assistant to the surveyor, Mr. Thomas Drummond, assistant to the naturalist, and 4 mariners. They were to sail to New York and then travel through a series of lakes and rivers to reach the Great Bear Lake, where they would spend the winter. Once the open season began, they planned to divide into 2 groups. One group would travel westward from the mouth of the Mackenzie, attempting to round Icy Cape and meet HMS Blossom in Kotzebue's Inlet. The other group would explore the coast eastward from the Mackenzie to the mouth of the Coppermine before returning to the Great Bear Lake overland. The first leg of the trip went smoothly, and on August 7, 1825, Franklin arrived at Fort Norman on the Mackenzie River. A tributary stream meets the river near this point with the Great Bear Lake. The weather was still good, so Franklin explored the river between Fort Norman and the sea before settling into winter quarters. He sent the main group of the expedition to the lake to build the necessary facilities, while he and Mr. Kendall continued downstream. They raced down the river and arrived at Ellis Island on August 16th, at a latitude of 69 degrees 14 and a longitude of 135 degrees 56 minutes. They were now on the shore of the Polar Sea, and were thrilled to discover that it was entirely ice-free and appeared easily navigable. At this point, a poignant event occurred. In 1823, Franklin married Miss Eleanor Purdon, whom he loved deeply. While he prepared for his journey, his wife fell ill and made him a small silken Union Jack to keep him company. She instructed him not to unfurl it until he reached the shores of the Polar Sea. A few days after he set sail, she passed away, and he received the news upon arriving in America. The story of unfurling her flag is as follows. The men pitched the tent, and I had the silk Union Jack hoisted, which my beloved late wife had made and given to me as a parting present, with the strict condition it should not be unfurled until the expedition reached the Polar Sea. I cannot describe my emotions as they fluttered in the breeze. Although it was natural and for the moment irresistible, I believed it was not right to darken the bright faces of my companions with my sadness. Therefore I joined in with the excitement and attempted to respond to their warm congratulations on planting the British flag on this remote island of the Polar Sea. Extra grog was issued to the men, and Franklin and Kendall readied to celebrate the occasion with a little brandy they had saved. Regrettably, the Canadian guide, Baptiste, in his excitement, gave them salt water instead of fresh, and they had to pour the ruined brandy on the ground. Franklin then erected a flagpole and placed beneath it a letter containing information about the nearest Hudson Bay Company station for Parry's use, should he reach the mouth of the Mackenzie. With that completed, Franklin began the return journey to Great Bear Lake, which he arrived at on September 4th. He discovered that winter quarters had been finished during his absence and had already been named Fort Franklin in his honor. The party had grown to 50 with fresh arrivals, and since they would need to rely heavily on fish for food during the winter months, and it was impossible to catch enough for so many at any one place, 2 more houses were built, 4 and 7 miles away. At the fort, 15 to 20 nets were continuously used, and the catches averaged from 300 to 800 a day in both summer and winter. Only once, near the end of winter, was the food supply in danger of running out, and the party had to go on short rations for a bit. Fortunately, at the critical moment, deer appeared, and Franklin was relieved of any further concern. Other than that, the winter was uneventful, and the party lived together in complete harmony, which was somewhat surprising given the diverse nationalities present, including English, Highlanders, Canadians, Eskimos, Chippewayans, Dog Ribs, Hare Indians, and Crees. On the 20th day of June, the 2 groups departed from the fort to embark on their expeditions of discovery. Franklin and Back, accompanied by 13 men and the Eskimo interpreter Augustus, were to crew the Lion and the Reliance and explore the coast to the west. Meanwhile, Dr. Richardson and Mr. Kendall, along with 10 men, were to survey the land between the Mackenzie and the copper mine. They traveled down the river together until the 4th day of July, when they split up and went their separate ways. On the 7th day of July, Franklin arrived at the river's mouth and encountered a group of Eskimos camped on an island. He attempted to negotiate with them, and things were going smoothly until the receding tide left the boats stranded. The Eskimos discovered that the boats contained a store of fascinating and unknown goods, unlike anything they had ever seen. They decided to take the goods for themselves rather than wait for future trade. They launched a spirited attack on the boats, which lasted for several hours, during which they took a significant portion of the expedition's property. Franklin and his men were at a disadvantage during the attack because they knew that if they used their firearms, they would eventually pay with their lives. However, they managed to prevent the loss of their more valuable property, such as their sails, oars, and astronomical instruments. Early the next morning, they managed to get the boats back out into deep water. Franklin and his crew finally rid themselves of their unwanted guests and proceeded westward. The next day, they encountered a friendlier group of Eskimos, who provided valuable information about the coast ahead. Unfortunately, their news was mostly discouraging. The ice tended to cling to the land throughout the summer, making navigation hazardous even if channels were found. The Eskimos suggested that the explorers bring dogs and sleds to help when the sea route proved impossible, a plan that was eventually proven effective in the polar regions. However, Franklin was cautious about relying too heavily on the Eskimos' knowledge, since they stayed close to the Mackenzie during the summer and could not know much about the more westerly seas. Taking advantage of a southerly wind that pushed the ice away from the shore, Franklin pushed on. He discovered several landmarks, including Points Sabine and King, Herschel Island, Canning River, and Flaxman's Island. They arrived at Foggy Island on August 10th and were stranded there until the 16th due to thick fog that obscured their course and posed a dangerous threat to their navigation. The crew had no choice but to wait for better weather before continuing on their journey. This untimely delay doomed the expedition. Those 6 precious days lost to the unforgiving elements could have been the difference between triumph and failure. If not for that setback, the team may have been able to link up with the advance party dispatched from HMS Blossom in Kotzebue's Inlet. But fate had other plans, and the group was forced to turn back to the Great Bear Lake, arriving on September 21st. Upon their return to Fort Franklin, they discovered that Dr. Richardson, Mr. Kendall, and their party had already completed their mission, having navigated the treacherous terrain to a successful conclusion. Though they faced their challenges with the Eskimos, they had no memorable adventures to report, having sailed steadily along the coast and named its most prominent features. From Liverpool Bay to Cape Bathurst, Franklin Bay to Cape Parry, and Dolphin and Union Strait to Cape Krusenstern, this intrepid group left their mark on the land. At the final location, Cape Krusenstern, situated at 68 degrees 23 minutes latitude and 113 degrees 45 minutes longitude west, The team connected their discoveries to those made by Franklin on a previous expedition. On August 8th, they arrived at the mouth of the copper mine, where they discovered the remains of a fire from Franklin's earlier journey. The river was too shallow to navigate with their boats, so they hauled them out of reach of floods and stored unnecessary supplies in their tents before embarking on the return journey by foot. On August 18th, they reached Fort Franklin after a 71-day absence, covering over 1,700 miles by land and water. The winter was mostly uneventful, save for some extremely frigid temperatures. To give an idea of the intensity of the cold, on January 24, 1827, when the temperature was 52 degrees below zero, Mr. Kendall froze mercury in a bullet mold and shot it from his pistol. However, that was not the coldest weather they experienced, as on February 7th, the thermometer dropped to 58 degrees below zero. During the summer of 1827, the party returned to England after an expedition that, while not completely fulfilling its intended purpose, had still gathered valuable information. Chapter 8. The North Polar Voyage of Parry. We need not concern ourselves with Captain Lyon's voyage in 1824. His orders were to explore the connection between the Melville Peninsula and the mainland, and to reach Repulse Bay and the Hecla. Instead of taking the usual route along the north of Southampton Island, he sailed south and up the west coasts of the island, nearly losing his expedition in the process. He returned home without reaching the bay. We also need not follow Captain Beechey and the Blossom to Kotzebue Sound, where they hoped to meet Franklin and his party. Beechey cruised as far as Icy Cape, while Mr. Elson led a search for Franklin's party along the coast up to Barrow Point, only 146 miles from Franklin's furthest point. Nothing of note occurred otherwise. Now we come to Parry's final and greatest voyage, which opened up a new era in Arctic exploration. He returned from his third journey in search of the Northwest Passage in October 1825. In the spring of 1826, he proposed a plan to Lord Melville, the First Lord of the Admiralty, to reach the North Pole with sled boats that could travel over ice or through open water. The idea came from Franklin, who had offered to command the journey himself. However, since Franklin was on his second journey through North America, Parry was commissioned to lead the expedition aboard the Hecla on November 11, 1826.